Good morning. You might grab your Bibles and turn back to Matthew 16, where Austin read for us. Appreciate him doing that for us. And that'll be where we'll start our discussion in just a moment. It is good to see you. We have almost a full building. We have somebody on every bench anyway, and so that's pretty good. And there are a few blank spots of people we are missing of our own, but we have a number of visitors here. And we are really thankful that you are with us. I think we say this pretty often, and I especially want to say it today. There may be things about our worship services that you're interested in knowing more about, why we do it in that particular way, or the things that we choose to do, and even some of the things that you would have expected to see when you go to church that you didn't see when you came here. And it's all right to have those questions, and we want to be able to answer them. And if we're not able to give an answer, then we need to do some self-evaluation. I think that we can give an answer for the things that we do here and how we have things structured and organized. And we would love to talk to you about that because our worship services here are a major aspect, but they are just one part of what it means to be a part of this congregation. There's so much that we want to be able to talk about with how we worship and the lesson that I'm going to present and the songs that we sing, but also in our classes and in the lives that we call each other to live to, the life that the gospel calls us to live to. It may very well be that you have questions about all of that, and we want to be able to answer. We want to know what God's Word has to say. We want to be able to live in keeping with that, and we want to be able to share that with others. And so we would love to have conversations about that if that's something that interests you. And even if it's not what interests you, we're about to have a conversation about it right now. So join in. Over the course of this year, we're engaged in a series that we're just calling Welcome to Quinn. And let me tell you this, that being welcome to Quinn is not the most important place to be welcome to. The most important place to be welcome to is into Christ. But we are a congregation of people who have made up our minds that what unifies us as a group ought to be that we are committed to Christ. We want to be shaped by Scripture. And we want the good news, the gospel of Jesus Christ, we want that to not only shape the way we live, but we want to proclaim that gospel to our area and through other means through the whole world. And when we think about this church as a church of Christ, I want to think about what that means. What does it mean to be a church or a congregation of Christ? What does that look like in the way that we're organized as a church? What does it even mean when does a church become of Christ? And what does that mean about our relationship to other churches that have Church of Christ on the sign or on the building or as their identifier? Well, I think we need to start by thinking about the word church. We think about the word church, of course, in a very religious context because that's about the only place we use the word church anymore. That's not the way it was used in the first century. In the first century, the word church just meant an assembly or a congregation. It's even used in our New Testaments to talk about like a political assembly, and it's used to even talk about like a mob that was gathering for a riot. And I have no intentions on such this morning, but we're still an assembly. We're still a congregation that's meeting here today. But it was used and is used throughout the New Testament. It's the Greek word ekklesia that means an assembly. It means a congregation of people. It means people who are meeting together for some purpose. They are gathered together. The word we use, church, is actually an old German word that had just been used to translate that word. And so congregation might be a word that conveys the idea a little more clearly, but we've just been handed down that word ever since the first translations in English have been made. So in the New Testament, we really see what I think we would call two levels of organization for Jesus church or Jesus congregation, this group of people. And the first is what we would call a universal sense. Now, this comes from what Austin read for us in Matthew chapter 16. Remember that Jesus asked the disciples who people were saying that he was. Their response, some of the people are saying you're a prophet, right? Maybe an old prophet or a more recent prophet, one of the prophets. Which is pretty high acclaim, right? To say that Jesus is a teacher that's from God, that he is a teacher who has a message from the Lord. That's a pretty That's a pretty high compliment. But Jesus narrows it down and says to the apostles, okay, who do you say that I am? And Peter is the one who answers, you are the Christ, the King, the Son of the living God. Now, as complimentary as prophet is, putting him as the anointed King, the Christ, the Son, the physical embodiment of the living God, that's on a whole nother spectrum. That's on a whole nother level. And Jesus doesn't say, whoa, dial that back a little bit. He says, you're right. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, or Simon, son of Jonah, because flesh and blood hasn't revealed this unto you, but my Father who is in heaven. And then he says, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell, or the gates of Hades, shall not prevail against it. What rock is Jesus talking about? Well, I think the rock that Jesus is talking about is that proclamation that Peter had made. The proclamation that Jesus is the King, the Son of the living God. Jesus says, on that principle, on that basis, I'm going to gather all of my people. Now, it's also true that we are in some ways built on an apostolic foundation, right? Ephesians chapter 2 talks about us being built on top of the apostles and the prophets, with Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone. The apostolic, or the ambassadors of Jesus, who proclaimed that he was the King, the Son of the living God, that has become the foundation upon which all of Jesus' people are gathered. When Jesus talks about building his church or building his congregation, he's not talking about a building. I don't even think he's talking about like a hierarchical institutional structure. It's not like he's creating some nonprofit organization, right, that he's going to invite people into. When Jesus talks about building his church, he's talking about gathering, assembling a congregation of people. Now, what is it that makes the church of Christ in that broad, universal sense? What makes someone a member of the church of Christ is that commitment to Jesus as the King, the Christ, the Son of the living God. That is the basis upon which Jesus' congregation is gathered. That is, all people of all time, in all places, who have given their allegiance to Jesus. That is the church of Christ in that grand universal sense. That is the church of Christ in the broadest sense. Jesus is the head of that church, and that church is his body, is one illustration. Now, flip over just a couple of chapters. Matthew chapter 18. Here is the second time, I believe, that Jesus uses this word church in the Gospels. And here it has a little bit of a narrower focus. In Genesis chapter, not Genesis, I don't know where that came from. We're not going all the way. Matthew chapter 18 and verse 15, Jesus says, if your brother sins, show him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. But if he does not listen to you, take 2 or 3 more with you, so that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every fact may be confirmed. Then notice verse 17. If he refuses it to them, to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as the Gentile and tax collector. Now, this is not Jesus' main point here to talk about organization or the nature of churches, but I do think we should see something here. When he says, when this sinner won't respond to your approaches and won't respond to 2 or 3 witnesses going with you, you tell it to the church. Now, let's think about this. If Jesus is talking about all the Christians of all time in all places, it's going to be really hard to tell it to the church, right? So what Jesus is talking about here is a congregation. It is an assembly, but it's what we would think of in a local sense, right? So if someone sinned against me, which wouldn't be any of you, I know, so we won't even use a hypothetical. But if someone sinned against me and I went to approach them and they didn't listen, and maybe I took the elders with me, 2 or 3, and they didn't listen, then what we might do is we might bring it to the church. I think that would be the appropriate pattern there. And I could tell the local church here about that. Now, what we need to see is that this church, this local church, is organized on a local level. That is, the church in that sense are disciples of Jesus who have agreed to meet and work together in a relatively close area at the same time, and that creates a local assembly. Now, the New Testament doesn't use the phrase universal or local assembly. But I think we see that through the Scriptures. When Jesus is talking about building His church, I think we can see that that's talking about all of the people that come to belong to Him. When we talk about a local church, there will be references throughout the New Testament to the church at Thessalonica or to the church at Philippi. And we know that's a local sense. But what we see is we only see the church organized on those two levels. That is, that there's a universal church and a local church. Now, I've got all that on the chart, but I want you to see this. What is the organization? What is the structure? What's the hierarchy of that universal church? It's very simple. Jesus is the head of the church. Now, what that means is when you commit to Christ, when you give your allegiance to Jesus, you are made part of this large assembly, this massive congregation, this universal body of people, and Jesus is your head. And every person who has given their allegiance to Jesus is part of that universal assembly. And you report directly to Him. All right? Now, what happens is that on a local church level, as we read through the New Testament, we see that these congregations are independent from one another, and they are led by men who are called elders or pastors or shepherds or overseers. There's other terms depending on how our Bibles translate that. And those shepherds, those elders, look to Jesus as the chief shepherd. He is the head of that local body. Now, I don't think this is difficult to understand, but I think 1 Peter 5 helps us, where he is writing to elders, and he said, I exhort the elders among you, this is 1 Peter 5, verse 1, as your fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ, and a partaker also of the glory that is to be revealed, shepherd the flock among you. So he uses elder and he uses shepherd. By the way, that word shepherd is the same place where we get pastor. All right. So people ask me if I'm a pastor. I'm not a pastor. Mr. Lonnie, Mr. Dwight, Mr. Jimmy. There are pastors, there are shepherds, are elders. And we use those terms interchangeably. Okay. Shepherd the flock of God among you, overseeing, not under compulsion, but willingly, according to God, and not for dishonest gain, but with eagerness. Nor yet as lording it over those allotted to you, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. All right, so think about this. You obey the gospel. You give your allegiance to Jesus. Jesus is the king. He is your head. He is the one to whom you owe your allegiance. You have a direct connection to Him. And then you're part of a local congregation. And in that local congregation, we listen to our shepherds, our elders. Now, the shepherds don't just get to make up the rules as they go. They don't get to just rule with disregard. They still have the chief shepherd. They are still subject to the head who is Christ. But they do have a greater degree of local supervision and oversight that we are called to respect. And you see that, verse 5, for example, you younger men, be subject to your elders. There is a authority relationship in that we do have to respect. Now, somebody becomes a member of a local church by agreeing to work and labor and worship and contribute to be a part of that local group. So we can use lots of examples, several examples, but we go to Acts chapter 9, and we'll look more at that in a bit as well. But in Acts chapter 9, what you have there is Saul of Tarsus has obeyed the gospel. He has the experience on the road to Damascus, then he's baptized in Damascus. Now, was Saul already a part of Jesus' body? Was he already a part of that universal congregation? Yes. When he was baptized, he belonged to Jesus. He was of Christ. He was in the church of Christ. But he goes down to Jerusalem. And at Jerusalem, he wants to, look at verse 26, he was trying to associate with the disciples. I think what he was doing is he was trying to be a member of that local congregation in Jerusalem. He wanted to join the work there. But understandably, the last reports that they had heard about Saul of Tarsus was that he had been persecuting and even giving his word to kill Christians. I don't want you being a member here, right? I got concerns about that. So they rejected him from being a member of that local church. Now, we'll talk more about this in a moment. But did that keep him from being part of Jesus' church? Was he still a part of the church of Christ? Yes. Barnabas will come along and say to the church at Jerusalem, y'all don't know about this, but he's obeyed the gospel. And he's been preaching about Jesus. And then what will happen, notice this, in verse 29, verse 27, Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles and recounted to them how he had seen the Lord on the road and that he had talked to him and how at Damascus he had spoken out boldly in the name of Jesus. So he was with them, moving about freely in Jerusalem, speaking out boldly in the name of the Lord. What happens is that Barnabas comes and makes the case for Paul, Saul of Tarsus, and he is able to join with the group there and is able to work with them. Now, I want you to think about this. Paul's status in the church of Christ, in the largest sense, didn't necessarily depend on whether or not Jerusalem accepted him onto their membership roll. He was already a part of the congregation of Christ that was built on the foundation that he was the King, the Son of the living God. But he certainly wants to be a part of that local congregation. And that came when he decided to associate himself, and the congregation accepted his desire to associate with them. Now, because of Jesus' relationship to all the saved, we call that the church of Christ, right? So when you're baptized and you obey the gospel and you give your allegiance to Jesus, what church are you a member of? Well, maybe no local church, but you're a member of the church of Christ that belongs to him. And then we have called this local congregation a church of Christ because even though we don't represent all of the Christians, we don't represent all of the Christians in Franklin County that are members of the Lord's church, I don't think. But we have called ourselves to be a church of Christ because he is the chief shepherd of this local congregation. Does that make sense? He's the chief shepherd of this group, and that's why we've identified this local church as a church that belongs to him that meets in this place. All right. Now, I think that we could refer to both as the church of Christ because he is head over the whole body and because he is the chief to which the elders and the congregation look to for guidance. Now, let me say this. While those who belong to Christ are his, and congregations made up of people who belong to him are his, we call ourselves a church, a congregation of Christ, not because we assume we've got everything right, but because we desire to belong to him, and we are striving to reflect that in all of our efforts. We don't want to be called something else because our highest priority is belonging to and honoring him. That's why we are called a church of Christ. Now, when is a church of Christ? Is it a little presumptuous for us to say, hey, we're of Christ? And somebody says, well, how do you know that? We know that because Jesus has promised that if we are built on the foundation that he is the King, the Son of the living God, we are part of his congregation. And we have come together to work together on the foundation that that's what we want to be, people who are committed to Him. Now, whether or not our sign says Church of Christ, well, just because our sign says Church of Christ does not determine whether we're in or out. Right? That's not the deciding factor. The deciding factor is our devotion to the Lord. In Acts chapter 2 and verse 42, this is the very first time I think that we would say this is a local church in the New Testament sense of the word. And in Acts chapter 2 and verse 42, these 3,000 that had just obeyed the gospel, they were continually devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to the prayers. And I think what we see in that is that's what made this local church. If we were going to ever say there was a Church of Christ, wouldn't we say that this Jerusalem church was a Church of Christ? And what they are characterized is by devotion to listening to the apostles because they were telling them what Jesus wanted them to do, and being unified, particularly in their prayer, in their breaking of bread. And we'll say they were unified together in taking care of one another as well. Now, when Paul wrote to the Philippian church, you can see there, Philippians 1 verse 1, he addressed them as all the saints who are in Philippi with the overseers, that's the elders, and deacons. And what we see is that the leadership of those local churches only had authority over the congregation over which they were made the elders. For example, over in Acts chapter 14, in verse 23, we see that they make their way back through all of those churches, all of those cities where they had established churches, and they come back, and I want you to see this in Acts 14, verse 23, when they had appointed elders for them in every church. Having prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord in whom they had believed. When he talks to the elders in Acts chapter 20 and verse 28, he tells them to shepherd the flock of God which is among you. And he says the same thing in 1 Peter chapter 5. Now, these elders had to meet specific qualifications. Now, let me say this. Not every congregation, not every Church of Christ has men qualified to serve in those roles. Sometimes they have to make do without elders. But the ideal is always to have elders in every local church. We're blessed to have 3 men overseeing this group. And they are called to oversee and to watch out for the group here and to stand against false teachers and to watch out for our souls. And what we see in the New Testament is we see the work of elders described as having an authoritative role over the local group, and including being responsible for the teaching and the spiritual care of the congregation. Also, in Paul's opening to the Philippians, he mentions the deacons. Now, a church can and should have deacons. The word just means a servant, and it could be translated that way. It does seem, though, that there was a specially designated, appointed role of servants to care for specific aspects. Deacons, like elders, have to meet certain qualifications. So here at Quinn, if I counted correctly, we have 7 men who are working as deacons. And the work of those deacons is, in many ways, to carry on work that makes it possible for the elders to primarily focus on spiritual congregational work. That doesn't mean that the elders never have input on the more logistical things. But on the whole, we have deacons who are responsible for the money and for the groundskeeping and for the technology, as bad as it may be from time to time. All of those things. And yet, all of those things are functioning for us to accomplish our overall purpose that the elders are supposed to be watching out for. I hope you see what I'm trying to say here. We've got a universal and local organization, and Jesus is the head of his church, and elders are the shepherds of those local congregations, of course, looking to Jesus as the chief shepherd. Now, let me say a few things about all of this. Let me blank that for a second. We don't see any organizational structure in between. And here's why that's important. There is no organization that binds multiple churches together in some kind of regional, national, or international way. That is, there is no Franklin County Conference of Churches of Christ where we all meet and decide what the rules are going to be for Churches of Christ. It just doesn't happen. Now, somebody would say, but don't the things you do as a Church of Christ look a lot what some other group on the other side of town would do as a Church of Christ? That may very well be the case. I would say it's probably because of similar commitments, but it's not because our elders all met up at some conference and decided what we were going to do. And I think you would be surprised at the range of things that churches with Church of Christ on the sign would practice. Somebody might ask, what does the Church of Christ believe on this? Well, it depends on what you mean by that. If by Church of Christ you mean those who belong to Him, maybe we'd have a pretty narrow definition. But if you mean by churches with Church of Christ on the sign, basically anything in the book is an option for what churches teach on that. And so we have to be careful with how we use that kind of phrasing. Now, let me say, just because there's no organizational structure doesn't mean we don't have a relationship with those other churches. We see that in the New Testament. The local churches would pass letters from the apostles to one another. They were called to pray for one another. They were helping one another when there was times of need. But they were not under any common leadership except Jesus Christ. We don't have any evidence of one group of elders going over to another congregation and overseeing their work or their finances or anything like that. There is one passage, can I show this to you? There is one passage that does describe the church, that is, the people who belong to Jesus in a region, right? Most of the time, it's universal or it's in a specific place. But in Acts chapter 9 and verse 31, so the church throughout all Judea and Galilee and Samaria was having peace. So if you use the King James, it says churches. So I asked Wes Brown, a mentor of mine who uses the King James, I asked, well, what do I do with that passage? And he says, well, it's no problem for me. I use the Authorized Version. So, okay, fair enough, right? Because churches would make sense, right? There's lots of different congregations. Church makes it a little different, right? Because this is the only place where church would be used to talk about multiple congregations, but not the universal church. What I think we ought to see here, though, is he is referring to all of God's people in Galilee, Judea, and Samaria, and what we never see is any way that they would be organized together. We don't see any structure or hierarchy or institutionalization of churches on that level. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that we don't have connections to other churches of Christ. We do. We support men who preach in other churches of Christ. And we take care of needy saints, perhaps, who are in other churches of Christ around the world. And we can and we should be praying for those churches. And we realize that we are partners in a united cause together. But that doesn't create some kind of institutional connection. And it certainly doesn't mean that every church that has Church of Christ on the sign and us are hand in hand for the same purposes. Because we're local and independent and devoted to maybe other things in those congregations. Now let me come back to these slides. Let me say that we need to understand that the Lord enrolls someone in the church, that is, in the universal sense. God is the one who adds somebody to his local, to his universal church. In Hebrews chapter 12, looking at verse 22, it says, "But you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to myriads of angels, to the festal gathering and the assembly," that's the word church, "of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect. Whatever is the membership role here at Quinn, we're not doing any enrolling in heaven. Right? We don't have the capacity to write in that book. The Lord does that enrolling. And He does that when someone is washed from their sins by the blood of Jesus and gives their allegiance to Him. And I want you to think about this. I think maybe the best example of this would be the Ethiopian eunuch. The Ethiopian eunuch is on a wilderness road between Gaza and Ethiopia. When he obeys the gospel, what local church is he a part of? Well, he's not part of one. But he goes on his way rejoicing because the Lord had enrolled him in heaven. You see that? So the Lord enrolls someone in the universal church. Now, that doesn't mean that local churches, the Lord enrolls someone in the universal church. That doesn't mean that local churches are unimportant to God. I think we can see that throughout the New Testament. But we need to understand, this is the point I want to make here, is that your membership in a local church is not the defining reality with regards to your status in Jesus' congregation, in the universal church. So, we see, looking at a couple of places, we see people who were members of local churches, but were separate from God because of the way they were living. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, I think this is a great example. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, there was a man who was a member of the church at Corinth who had his father's wife. I don't know the details of that. Don't want to know. But it was a bad situation. It was so bad that Paul said even the nations, even the Gentiles think this is beyond normal, beyond the ordinary. And he says, you need to separate him from your group because he needs to see that this is not okay and you don't want that influencing the rest of the group. Here was a man who was a member of a local church who was not in right standing with God. And I think we see that in other places as well. Now, being a member of a local church doesn't guarantee right standing with Jesus. But it is clear throughout the New Testament that people would seek a local church to be a part of because there are dozens of passages in the New Testament calling us to do things that it's almost impossible, if not totally impossible, to do outside of the context of a local congregation. Like not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, or coming together to break bread, or loving and building up one another and showing hospitality, or partaking of the Lord's Supper, or speaking to one another in psalms and hymns. See, all of those things demand us assembling in some way for that to happen. Now, the word church is used in one other way that we need to note. And it's also used to talk about when the church assembles or meets. In fact, through 1 Corinthians 14, it's used to talk about the congregation congregating, or the assembly assembling, or the church churching, right? So if you've obeyed the gospel, if you've given your allegiance to Jesus, you are always a member of His church, the church of Christ in that broadest sense. And when you become a member of a local church like Quinn, you are always a member of that local church. But when we assemble, it's a special setting. It's an assembly setting because we're not always an assembled assembly. And within that assembly, there are special activities and there are special regulations, which we'll talk about later. If you want to see that before we get to that, you can just read 1 Corinthians 14. And there are rules about speaking and who can and who can't and when they can and when they can't. And the reason that's significant is because those rules don't apply all the time, but they do apply when the church is assembled. Okay. Now, let's come to a close. Are you a part of the church of Christ? And I need you to understand that when I ask that, I am not asking you if you are part of the Church of Christ denomination. Not my primary concern. Not my concern at all, actually. And I'm really not asking you if you are part of a local church that calls itself a Church of Christ. I'm asking if you are part of the body of disciples that have committed to Jesus, having been washed of your sins and given your allegiance to Him as the King of Kings. That is the fundamental question. Then I want to know, are you a part of a Church of Christ in the local sense? Your commitment to Jesus, of course, is first and foremost. But part of your commitment to Him is a call to be committed to brothers and sisters who have also committed themselves to Him. Are you a part of a Church of Christ? And again, I'm not asking just, are you on the roll of a church that has Church of Christ on the sign? But are you a member of an active group of disciples who meet and work and worship together in devotion to Jesus Christ, guided by the Scriptures? That's what matters when we're talking about a local congregation. Now, if you want to be a part of Jesus' universal body, if you want to be a member of that assembly of all the saved, of all time, in all places, then the right response is to give your allegiance to Jesus. And if you want to know what that looks like, I will tell you that all of our elders, our preachers, our Bible class teachers, and I would say virtually all of our members would be able to sit down with you and show you what it would take to become a part of the church that Jesus promised to build on the foundation that He's the King. And if you want to be a part of this local congregation, because you think that this would be a place where you can share in the work of meeting together and worshiping and contributing, if you want to be a member of this local congregation, then our elders would be happy to talk to you about that, because they would love to join hands, stand arm in arm with people who are ready to serve the Lord. Of course, our ultimate commitment is to Christ. And then we want to devote ourselves to one another, because that's what being devoted to Him looks like. We would love to talk to you more about that. And if you are, let me just say, a member of Jesus' body, and maybe you're a member of this local congregation, but you realize that your commitment to Him has fallen and your devotion to one another has not been what it ought to be, then today would be a great day to recommit to being a part of a congregation that belongs to Jesus and being a meaningful part of that. And we can talk more about what that means. If there's some way we can encourage you, help you, instruct you, or lift you up, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.